Hello, welcome to our Center on the Future of Wars Fall Speaker Series. We're thrilled to have all of you here with us, and our guest tonight is Javier Garza Ramos, a journalist from Mexico, who's going to be speaking on journalism under fire, how Mexican reporters protect themselves. For those of you not familiar, the Center on the Future of War is a partnership between ASU, Arizona State University, and a think tank in DC called New America. And we explore issues of security threats at the present and security threats on into the future through educational programming, through research and publications, and also through a variety of public outreach, such as this event tonight. Javier Garza Ramos is an independent journalist who's based in northern Mexico. He's the co-host of Expansión Daily, one of the most popular news podcasts in Mexico, and he runs the local news platform Enre Tu Laguna and the radio newscast Reporte 100. For the past 15 years, he has worked as a journalist on journalism protection and press freedom issues. As editorial director of El Siglo de Torreón, he led a newsroom that came under fire from drug cartels operating in his city and developed safety protocols that are now used in newsrooms in several countries. He's a contributor to El País and the Washington Post. He was a Knight Fellow at the International Center for Journalists, focusing on digital security, and is the recipient of a special citation of the 2022 Maria Moors Cabot Prize for Journalism in the Americas, which is given out by Columbia University. So we're thrilled to welcome Javier Garcia with us tonight. Very briefly, Javier will speak about this issue, about how Mexican reporters protect themselves under dangerous and difficult conditions. And then we'll open up for Q&A from all of you. And the way that we'll do that is to have you drop your questions into the Q&A box in Zoom, and I'll play the role of moderating those questions. So again, thanks so much for joining us, and thank you, Javier, for beaming in from Mexico tonight.
Thank you, Daniel, and I really appreciate the invitation, and thank you for the to ASU for hosting this. And I looked at the program of the previous talks, and what's a really quite impressive series. I guess I'd begin by saying, how we link the future of war, the idea of future of war, with the current war that we're living in Mexico. It's really, as most of you know, surely, Mexico is considered one of the most dangerous places for journalists in the world, and certainly the most dangerous country that is not in an actual war, in an actual conflict, because the drug war in Mexico is so difficult to define and to peg down, because it's really not one war. It's just a series of mini wars or mini conflicts that are going on in different parts of the city, and that change the locations, every so often. As a way of example, I live in the city of Torreón, which is in northern Mexico. It's a metropolitan area of about 1.3 million people. It straddles two states, the state of Coahuila and the state of Durango. And it's basically, for general location, it's about 6 hours south of the Texas border. And it is a city that for years, ever since its founding, about in the late 19th, early 20th century, has been a hub for transportation, because this is one of the main routes for communications between Mexico and the United States, the railroads and roads. And so for the past 50 years, it had been one of the main corridors for drugs flowing from Mexico into the United States. About 70% of the drugs that went from Mexico to the border and from there crossed into the US passed through this region. So it was a strategic place for the cartels for moving the drugs. But then about 15 years ago, about 2007, it became the turf in a turf war, because there was another cartel that wanted to control the territory. region has historically been controlled by the Juarez cartel and the Sinaloa cartel, and then the Zetas wanted to move in, and so they unleashed a wave of violence that lasted about 6 years, from 2007 to about 2013. And just to give you an idea of how bad it went, in 2007, we had a total of 90 homicides in the entire metropolitan area in the whole year, 90. By 2012, the metropolitan area had 1,100 homicides. So that was like a 12-fold increase. And so that sort of gives you a picture of how bad the violence became. And as you know, the region deteriorated in about a decade ago. We saw other regions in Mexico that were more peaceful, you know, that didn't have these problems. When the violence in my city, in Torreón, started going down, because the turf war was eventually resolved in favor of one drug cartel that became dominant again, and so the violence it came down just by the simple result of that happening. There were no longer were there two groups warring one another, and then also clashing with the army and with security forces. The violence came down, but then we saw violence erupting in other places that had been peaceful. For example, the Bajío region in the state of Guanajuato, in León, which is a region that from the year 2000 to about 2020 had a huge economic and industrial expansion, and then it became a prized possession of the drug cartels that were controlling the flow of drugs, but they were also controlling other activities that they began to sink their teeth into, like, for example, theft of fuel and migrant trafficking, for example, contraband trafficking, extortion, and other types of crime. And so violence erupted in the region of El Bajío about 5 years ago, in a place that had, before that, had been pretty peaceful. We also saw states that didn't have violence problems and then began to have them, like the state of Guerrero, for example. We saw places that were capturing headlines 15 years ago or 10 years ago, like Ciudad Juarez, and then violence came down. So the dynamics are very, very diverse, depending on which region of Mexico. So I just wanted to mention this as sort of context as to what journalists are dealing with when it comes to covering violence, because it turns out that we were basically covering a local war in our midst. And one of the first things that happened when criminal organizations start clashing with each other and start fighting for control of a territory is that they pay close attention to what is being said about them, you know, what is being published about the violence they unleash. And so naturally, they want to control it by the only way that they know how to, which is by violence. So they start threatening journalists, they start killing journalists as warnings, or they might kill journalists that publish things that they don't like. When I was the editor of the newspaper here, which is the largest newspaper in the region, our building was attacked 5 times by armed groups. They just shot at the building as a way to send us a message that we shouldn't be publishing something or other. You know, once we ran the story, for example, about a cartel boss being arrested, and the next day, an armed group came up to the building and just shot at it, and then they exploded a car and set it on fire in front of the main entrance. I mean, just to give you an idea. In another time, 5 workers were kidnapped as a way to send us a message that we should stop publishing stories about violence that was being unleashed by a criminal group. And they were basically kidnapping buses and setting them on fire, and we were publishing all of that, and they weren't happy about it. They had this crazy notion that people were in a panic, not because of the violence that they were carrying out, you know, the homicides that they were carrying out and the bodies that they were dumping in the streets, but because of the fact that it was showing up in the newspapers and in the television newscasts. So it has forced Mexican journalists to be more aware of the risks that we face. Journalists used to think about safety more in terms of, if we go out and cover something that is dangerous, like a conflict. And journalist security for decades was geared mostly to journalists that were going out to cover a war zone, and they received some training and they received some equipment, and you saw, journalists taking protections when they were covering, events in places like Bosnia or Afghanistan or Iraq, and that is those were the places when we were usually seeing the journalists getting killed. But the phenomenon that has been going on for about the last 2 decades has been more and more journalists being killed as a result of violence unleashed in the cities where they live and in the places where they work. And it can be as true of Torreón in Mexico as it is in Rio de Janeiro, for example, where gangs are known to target journalists who are reporting on drug dealing in the city's favelas, for example. And it is also true in the cities of Honduras, for example, that are also controlled by gangs that are engaged in drug dealing. So we really had to start paying more attention. And of course, covering violence in mostly narco violence is very different from covering a war zone. It's not that you're going out and the shooting starting. You're not going there to cover actual clashes. What happens in cities like this is that at any moment, in any place in the city, somebody might start shooting at somebody else, for example, or somebody might be dumping a corpse in a street corner. And the way how we cover that becomes very delicate, because that is, of course, the doing of the cartels, and they might unleash some consequences if they don't like what is being printed. So we had to be very careful about how we reported the stories, and we had to start developing some protocols. They came about as more of a trial and error process, and we were building, up measure upon measure, depending on the different scenarios that we were encountering. For example, it used to be that reporters covering the police beat were the first to arrive at a crime scene. They arrived usually before the ambulance, whenever there was a homicide or whenever there was a robbery or an accident or whatever. And so it's just the basic impulse of the journalist to try to arrive at the scene first and get the story. We stopped doing that, and we had to tell the reporters, you can't go to a place that is, an active crime scene by yourself. You have to go accompanied by, maybe a photographer or a reporter from another news organization to sort of try to build a safety cocoon around you. And you have to be very aware of your surroundings. Take care that nobody's following you, because there could be the possibility that some criminals might start following the reporters and threaten them about how they should publish the story about what just happened. So that was like another measure that we took. We started also taking measures within the newsroom about how we were going to publish the stories. Everybody knows the local news mantra, mostly the TV local news mantra, that if it bleeds, it leads. Knowing that whatever sensational crime story opens a newscast is bound to get more audience. And it might work when you're dealing with accidents, when you're dealing with street brawls, when you're dealing with a robbery or something like that. But when you're dealing with, a hitman going up to a bar or a restaurant and just firing indiscriminately, killing 10 people, it becomes more sensational than that. And I think that also the criminals understood this, because they knew that the more spectacular the way they carried out a crime, the more play it was going to get in the newspaper or in the telecast. I usually use an example that it's gory and it's kind of bloody, but I think it illustrates quite well. The story about a corpse being dumped in the street, of a person killed by a drug cartel, gets a certain kind of play in the newspaper. Maybe just a story. If that corpse, if the body is dismembered, which is also a routine practice by cartel members, then it becomes even more spectacular and might get even more play. We decided that we weren't going to make those distinctions. We decided that we were going to treat every homicide basically the same. We might specify in the story whether the body was decapitated or mutilated, or whether there was a message, or whether the body showed signs of torture or things like that. But we were not going to give it a play in the headline or in the picture, because that might be us carrying the message that the criminals wanted to carry. And so we would become unwilling spokesperson for whatever message they wanted to send to the community, which was basically a power message. It's, we're here and we're doing this, and we're doing this with total impunity, because that was the other thing, that nobody ever gets punished for those criminal acts. So we had to be more circumspect about what we were publishing. There was also a tendency of news organizations to publish what the so-called counters, the death-o-meters, and they were basically saying, so many people were killed today, and 6 people were killed today, and that means 14 people were killed this month, and 200 people killed so far this year. That was also a way to sort of play on the sensationalism of the story. But we also found a way, and I think that the violence also prompted us to be more creative in the ways that we would approach the coverage. We found that we needed to find a way to make people, to help people make sense of what was going on in the city. So, for example, instead of saying 2 people were killed today, we started carrying statistics. And we would publish those statistics not daily, like those counters were usually published daily, but we would publish them like monthly or twice a month. And we were saying, homicides increased by so-and-so percent this month compared to next month, or in the first half of this year compared to the first half of last year. We started carrying out statistics about robberies and armed robberies and kidnappings, as a way to help people understand the violence was increasing or decreasing in the city. Unfortunately, at a time when violence was doing nothing but increase, we started running out of ways to say that violence was on the rise. But it always helped, if we were trying to make sense of what was going on, and it kept us from having to publish the most gory, bloody details of a particular crime story, which we knew that we're just sensationalizing the story, into a more sober coverage of what was really going on in the larger community, and what was the impact that it was having in the larger community, and how the violence was impacting education, mental health, the economy, entertainment. The stories about, there were no theater plays or no concerts because people were afraid to go out at night, and restaurants started to close because people weren't going out at night out of fear. That was a more effective way of telling the community the whole story, rather than focusing on the bloody details of a particular crime. And I think that kind of sophistication also made us a bit more safe, because the criminals never really understood that we were still talking about the violence without really talking about the daily violence that they were carrying out. So, we published the story about the killings and the shootings, but with some exceptions, depending on where they were or what time of day, with some exceptions, we mostly focus on what kind of impact the violence was having in the city. And so I think that those are some of the lessons that we learned, and I think that many journalists are learning, that if you step away from covering the day-to-day violence and give the public a broader story, a story that helps them understand what is going on, and particularly start demanding action from the authorities, then it becomes a much more useful service to the community. Now, not everybody is doing this. It really depends on where the violence is happening. Different cities have different dynamics. There are cities where the local crime bosses might decide to be more aggressive against the media, and there are cities where they would decide that they don't really care, about what they publish. And so you have to first understand and sort of try to get into the mind of the criminals and see how they are acting or reacting. So when we started coming up with different safety measures, we also started doing some rudimentary form of risk evaluation and try to make sense of the situation and say, okay, who is attacking, right? Because not every journalist is under attack by drug cartels. You can also be political bosses, for example, elected officials, the local mayor. Sometimes it might be elected officials acting in concert with criminals. Sometimes it might be security forces. But if they're security forces, sometimes it might be the local police, but sometimes it might be the army or the federal police. So you have to really know who is your main attacker or your main aggressor. And so you to take steps to protect yourself from them. So that risk evaluation went through detecting, who is my main attacker? What are their capabilities to attack? What is the mode in which they attack? Do they shoot at the building? Do they kidnap and beat a reporter as a way to send a message? Do they phone in the threats? Or, it might be an elected official that is trying to hack your phone, and find out what you're investigating, right? It might be a police commander sending verbal threats, for example. You have to get very specific as to who is the aggressor and what are the main forms of aggression, so that you can take the necessary precautions. At the beginning, it might seem pretty difficult because you don't really know what is going on, but eventually you start trying to kind of figuring it out. Some people will tell you, well, if you have reporters go when they cover a crime scene, they should go wearing a bulletproof vest. And we found out that wasn't really helpful, because if a reporter was kidnapped, wearing a vest, a bulletproof vest, was really useless. Most reporters, for example, when most of the reporters who have been killed in Mexico were kidnapped before they were killed. So wearing a bulletproof vest or driving an armored car, it didn't really help, right? Carrying a weapon is also kind of out of the question, because you don't really know how to use it, and you don't really know if you're going to be able to use it, when you're face down with an AK-47 or something like that. So you have to really think through the problem and try to avoid the instinctive reactions. And when we do the trainings, that is usually where I start, by telling the reporters, you have to figure out who is your main enemy, right? Who is the one that wants to attack you, and what kind of capabilities they have, so that you might prepare more adequate safety measures. There is also a more uncertain elements here at play, in which sometimes reporters get threatened by criminal groups, by a cartel, but not because they're publishing stuff about the cartels, but because they're publishing stuff about the local authorities. And local authorities, in collusion with criminal groups, they use the criminal groups to intimidate the reporters. So as a way to avoid having to do it themselves, it scares the journalists sufficiently, being threatened by an organized crime group, that they usually stop publishing stuff about them. So the threats become more effective. Sometimes local authorities might outsource the job of killing a reporter to a criminal group as a way for them to have some deniability, and also as a way to avoid the crime from being investigated, because most of the crimes against journalists that come from criminal groups, from organized crime, usually don't get investigated. Local prosecutors are also intimidated. Sometimes they might be corrupt, or sometimes they just be swamped with so many crimes having to be investigated that they just, kick this one down the road. It is a problem, because when authorities don't want to admit that they have a problem of violence against the media in the places that they govern, they usually attributed the crimes against journalists to something other than a journalistic or a professional motive. And they would say, well, that journalist, he was into something, or he was colluding with criminal groups, or he was in debt, or he was cheating on another man's wife, or something like that. That they've even resorted to that. Anything to keep them from having to admit that there is a problem of, somebody trying to silence the media in the places where they govern. And that is also why some of the institutions that have been created in the past decade to supposedly protect journalists have not been effective. The special prosecutors, for example, when they investigate a crime against a journalist, they might take months to determine if that crime was professionally motivated. There was a case, for example, of a journalist in Veracruz in 2014 that he got kidnapped, and there were calls for the federal prosecutor of crimes against freedom of expression, which is an actual office in the federal government. There were calls for that office to investigate the crime, but they sort of, said, well, we're investigating whether this was professionally motivated. That reporter who was kidnapped turned up dead 6 days after his kidnapping. And the special prosecutor took 2 months to determine that the kidnapping was professionally motivated. And so they were going to investigate the crime as a crime against freedom of expression. But that person had been kidnapped for 6 days. If they had acted fast enough, deciding that, the crime warranted an immediate response because it was a crime against the journalist for doing his work, then, that he might have been released probably, or at least there might have been a more effective investigation instead of letting 2 months pass before they decided that the reporter was actually kidnapped and killed because of his work as a journalist. So it's a pretty dysfunctional institution. Mexico also has a protection mechanism, which was created in the federal government in 2012, in which a journalist that gets a threat can call up the mechanism and activate activate some protection measures. They might give him a panic button. They might give him or her an armed escort, or an armored car, or might help with relocating that person, for example. It still hasn't been pretty effective because the mechanism can take up to 9 days to determine whether the threat is credible. And in those 9 days, many threats have been materialized before the protection measures have been assigned. And in some cases, journalists who were under protection measures by this mechanism have been killed, which basically shows that the mechanism is also pretty ineffective. And the reason that those institutions have been ineffective is just basically a culture of a lack of culture of the rule of law in Mexico. Governments don't pay a political price for so much violence against the media. There have been 15 journalists killed this year so far. In the current government of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, so far in the 4 years, almost 4 years, that he has been in office, there have been more killings of journalists in the 4 months of this presidency than in the first 4 years of this presidency, I'm sorry, than in the first 4 years of the previous presidency. And so this government is on track to adding up more journalists killed and more attacks against journalists than the previous administration. In 2018, there was an average of 1 attack per day against a journalist, as documented by the organization Article 19 in their report. You know, of the crimes, killings, attacks, threats, beatings, kidnappings, surveillance that could be documented. In 2018, there was about 1 per day averaging. Right now, the average is about 2 per day. So it is about double. And those are the ones that get documented. You know, those are the ones that get reported and denounced. So many of them don't get reported and denounced because journalists are pretty intimidated about reaching out to authorities and say, you know, I've been threatened or I've been attacked. So we are resorting more and more to try to develop our own safety protocols, our own safety measures, and we're trying to protect ourselves against any number of actors. It's not just criminals now. It's mostly public officials. Their preferred method of intimidation is the threat. And sometimes those threats get materialized, effectively sending a message to other journalists. Those threats coming mostly from local authorities like mayors, local councilmen, local police chiefs, local party bosses. And because it goes on at the local level, there is a lot of political complicity that makes those crimes, you know, not investigated, that they're not, or that they won't be investigated. And there is not a political price to pay for that. If anything, it gets worse because, and we're seeing this not just in Mexico, but in other places, the political polarization has made attacks against the press more frequent, and they're carried out with more impunity. And we see, you know, from the president on down, stigmatizing the press, attacking the press, labeling them as liars, as fake news, even when they're doing legitimate work and legitimate investigation. So people are usually get a growing hostility against the news media. There's also a growing concern with digital attacks. That we're seeing some cases of hacking using the software Pegasus by the previous Mexican government, but also by the current Mexican government, hacking the phones of journalists who were investigating corruption, who are investigating violence, who are investigating abuses on the part of the army or the security forces, and they're getting their phones hacked. But there is also more rudimentary or primitive forms, you know, like surveillance, phone tapping. You know, basically every governor has the phones of local journalists tapped to see what they're talking about, you know, what they're investigating, what are the issues that they're dealing with. So that is also a growing concern on digital security. And it makes an environment much more difficult for the press to operate in because of the growing hostility. Sometimes the work is losing credibility, or sometimes legitimate investigations get attacked as fake news, which is another issue of freedom of expression that I think is going to become much more common. You know, labeling something fake news not because it's fake, but because the politician that is the subject of the story didn't like it. So he can just basically blast, stigmatize the journalist or the local news organization. It's a much more hostile environment. And, you know, it's sometimes it's disheartening, but we are seeing this as more of a global trend. You know, it's not something that is going on just in Mexico. And that is something that sometimes gives us pause to think about what is the future of journalism and how we are going to cope with an increasingly hostile environment. for journalists reporting in Mexico right now, the most risk occurs at the local level. You see, journalists in Mexico City, they might have more exposure. Their organizations have more prominence or a wider audience. And so an attack against them might make more waves. But an attack against local journalists is something that really doesn't transcend too much. There might be some cases, but it is at the local level that is becoming much more difficult. I've had the experience of dealing with this about a decade ago. The violence went down in my city, but as it went down, I started seeing other places in Mexico, that were just basically catching fire, like Guanajuato or Querétaro or Guerrero, Sinaloa, and Jalisco, for example. And you start seeing journalists there really scared because they don't know how to react. The violence might be new for them. We're gaining a lot of experience now. And we have been able to establish some safety measures about how to cover drug cartels, how to cover crime, how to cover political corruption in such a way that we start thinking about safety first. It's not self-censorship. Sometimes the instinct is to, well, I'm just not going to publish anything about this. That is, of course, the wrong way to go about the issue. But it's more, I'm going to think through the problem first. I'm not going to be so instinctive or so reactive, but I'm going to think through the problem, and I'm going to assess my risk, and I'm going to act accordingly, and I'm going to publish the story, but taking into account certain precautions. It has also made us be more rigorous in our reporting, more mindful of just stating the facts, trying not to give too much interpretation into what is going on, but also more creative into how are in what ways we can cover the violence that is not going to get us into so much trouble, but is still going to allow us to keep carrying on this story and helping a community make sense about it. So I'm going to stop there, and I'd be happy to get into a Q&A or get into a dialogue about any questions that anyone might have.
Thank you so much, Javier. So those of you who want to present questions, please just drop them into the Zoom Q&A box. The Committee to Protect Journalists found this year, 2022, that the number of journalists killed in Mexico is the highest number of journalists killed anywhere in the world since they've been tracking this issue. In that context, what specifically are the sorts of protections and protocols that you're able to help train your fellow journalists, if not in Torreón, then in other places? What is it? What are the key elements? Are there communication trees? Are there, obviously you mentioned bulletproof vests and armored cars aren't the way to go, but what are the core principles and what specific actions do you suggest that your fellow journalists take on?
Yeah, that report is pretty worrisome, especially because we're seeing the violence go up instead of down, and so we feel that nothing is being done. All of these journalists, were journalists killed doing local stories. They were investigating corruption, or they were publishing crime stories. And most of them operated also under very precarious circumstances. They're probably freelance journalists or journalists that that published on a website. And so they are not, they don't have many resources to pour into journalist protection. So protecting them becomes very, very difficult. Some of the basic safety measures that I train other journalists on is start with risk evaluation. And if you're investigating something, try to anticipate the reaction, right? And so if you're exposing corruption by the local mayor, try to plan for what's going to happen after you publish that. maybe publish it and then get the hell out of there for a while, right? While you can get some protection measures. Get your family out, for example, might be another one. Go underground for a little while. You have to try to anticipate, that reaction. One of the things that I did, for example, is instead of publishing it myself, I used to share it with a larger news organization, maybe a national news organization. So if you put it out there and then you just republish it, right? But it's already out, right? And no local mayor is going to go attack a national newspaper, for example, for running a story about their corruption, because it might make them more exposed, right? So you might think first, before publishing, about anticipating the reaction and see if there is a way that you can go around it. You still publish the story, but you take care that you minimize your risk. There are some ways to go about it. One of the things that I did, again, is share it with somebody else, and you kind of, it's not spreading the risk because it wasn't putting somebody else at risk. It was of a news organization that was mostly shielded by its prominence. And then once you put it out there through other means, then you just pick it up and run it yourself. It's a pretty effective way. But unfortunately, many journalists are still publishing a lot of stories in an instinctive manner and not thinking through what the consequences is going to be. It's not something that you should do, of course. I mean, it's, as a journalist, you should, you would wish that you live in a society where authorities are going to protect you from the mayor going crazy and targeting you. But unfortunately, that doesn't happen. So you have to take on the added responsibility of protecting yourself.
Here's a question from Warren Egmond. Can you identify which groups are the most responsible for violence against journalists? Drug gangs, criminals, politicians, or others, and in what proportions?
Well, according to Article 19, which is it's the best source because they publish a yearly report on the attacks and the threats that they document. According to them, more than half come from public officials. And they mostly come from local mayors and local police chiefs or police commanders. But usually those attacks are the most invisible ones. Those tend to be threats, surveillance, some form of intimidation, like stalking or harassment, cyber harassment in some cases. So they're not as they don't have a high impact. The ones that have the highest impact are, of course, the killings of journalists, the armed attack against the offices of news organizations. They're usually carried out by drug cartels. Drug cartels are responsible for about 20% of the attacks. They're not the majority of the attacks, but they are the most high impact. They are the most visible. They are the ones that use the most violence. And so usually those are the ones that we get to focus on. But the main predator of journalists in Mexico are local, are public officials.
Is there a way in which Mexican journalists adjust their reporting on violence in relationship to who's responsible for it? For example, I could imagine a lot of drug cartels are interested in reporting on acts of violence because it increases the fear of their retribution and might even increase their reputation in some ways, some circles, whereas perhaps other players, maybe politicians, might not want the same kind of reporting. So is it part of the job of being a Mexican journalist to adjust the reporting on violence based on who the perpetrators are?
No, definitely. And again, you shouldn't do it because you're supposed to live in a country where there is rule of law and the authorities need to respond to that, but that doesn't happen, of course. So we need to do. Yeah, we need to adjust to that. one of the things that I did, for example, is something that I advised them to do is develop a concept that I call editorial security. You know, it's when you're in the newsroom and you're deciding how you're going to play a story, you know, how do you go about it? And I go back to the example that I was saying about running a story of a dead, you know, a corpse in the street versus the story of a decapitated corpse or the story of a mutilated corpse, is to treat everything the same, right? It's everything the same, regardless of what group is doing it also, because when you're covering a turf war, it's very tempting to say, well, this person killed today was a member of the Sinaloa cartel, or this person killed today was a member of the Zetas cartel. And it kind of looks like you're keeping score, right? And they're pretty sensitive to that. So we avoided that completely, right? Also because there wasn't any official source that was going to tell us, you know, this guy was from Sinaloa or this guy was from the Zetas. We didn't do that. We just go with basic facts. You know, a man was killed today at such and such place, at such and such hour, and in such and such manner. And be very circumspect with the facts. Try not to overplay them, you know, with a big, you know, bloody photograph or a big sensational headline. And so that is a way to sort of keep everything on a low key. You're still doing your duty to inform, but you're not sensationalizing the violence. Sometimes you have to resort to you know, some ways of, you know, I'm going to run the story and then I'm going to see how I protect myself because I can't avoid running the story. There was in 2011, for example, there was a shootout between criminals and police officers outside a football stadium while the local soccer team was playing in a nationally televised match. And the shooting was heard inside the stadium. Some of the bullets ricocheted inside the stadium. People were, of course, panicking, right? And they were running through the bleachers. And, you know, all of this was televised. You know, it was a huge impact that this story had. So we were in the newsroom, you know, organizing the story. And I remember that as my editors and I were writing the front page story and we were deciding on the headline, one of the editors said, you know, what happens if they call us, right? They meaning, what happens if the criminals that were doing this call us and tell us that we shouldn't publish the story, right? Because that's usually, that is something that they used to do at some points. And we said, well, we can't, you know, we can't, this is something that we have to publish. You know, we can't put out a newspaper the next day saying nothing happened in the city, you know, not something as big as that. So we talked to the newsroom and we said, well, we're going to run the story, but tomorrow everybody's going to keep a low profile, you know, try to change the routes that you use when you go about, you know, when you go to work or when you're going to cover. We shifted some of the beats so the reporters wouldn't have the predictable routines and things like that. Just basically, you know, publish and then try to do your best to avoid a consequence.
The numbers of those disappeared and the numbers of those killed in Mexico in the last, say, several decades are staggering. The overall Mexican official count is 100,000 disappeared. That goes back quite a few years, but the majority of them are more recent. And the number of those killed since 2006 is over 360,000. So this is being sponsored by the Center on the Future of War. And of course, nobody looks at Mexico and uses the term war to describe the on-the-ground reality. And yet the numbers of those impacted by political violence or violence with a political component are really at levels that mirror the levels that we see oftentimes in wartime. So I'm just wondering, what is the language that you feel is the best to describe this overall situation to give readers or the public in general a feeling for the scope and severity of this violence?
I go back to something that I say at the beginning. It's not a war, but it's a lot of mini wars because they are going on at the very local level and they shift from place to place. And it's not, when you think about traditional conflict, you think about two warring factions, right? And, might go back to maybe the war in Bosnia, for example, was Serbs against Croats, and then Croats against Muslims, and Muslims against Serbs. But you basically had like, a very predictable read into who was the participants in the conflict. Here, it's very diverse because you have, dozens of local criminal organizations that are fighting amongst themselves. Sometimes they're fighting amongst themselves. Sometimes they're fighting the army, or sometimes they're fighting the local police. So it's different dynamics in every part of it, in every part of the country. So it feels like a mini war in every part of the country. And if you add up the numbers, of course, it goes up to 40,000 homicides in a year, for example. But because they are not happening in a very concentrated period of time, in a concentrated place, it doesn't feel like a war. Also associated wars with smaller places, like Bosnia is the size of a Mexican state, right? Or El Salvador is the size of a Mexican state. It has the population of the city of Monterrey, for example. But Mexico is a huge country. And so it's not concentrated in just one part. We might think maybe it's a civil war, for example, but it's, a staggering number of little wars going on in each community, and each one unfolds in a different way. It's more unpredictable.
Have your own reporting practices changed over the years? The Torreón was a site of severe violence and drug wars several years ago. It's calmed down based on your reporting. But how has this changed your professional work as a journalist, your experience covering violence, and your experiences, trying to adjust your work to a context of so much insecurity?
Well, if anything, or the impact is that it's changed for the better, because we have learned to be more rigorous with the facts. Before this drug war, before the wave of violence, if you looked at the crime, the local section of the newspapers usually carried one page with all of the crime stories, the accidents and the robberies and everything. It was a fountain of literature. The reporters were just, flowing their prose, and they were like they were writing a novel, about how the guy had raped the woman, or how the thief had stormed the bank, or something like that. And there was a lot of speculation. There was a lot of unconfirmed facts. This made us be more rigorous in our reporting. We stopped reporting the rumors, for example. And it meant, because we were aware that, if we started publishing rumors, it might create a panic. In some cases, we might even be aiding the criminals who like to create the rumors to spread panic. That was something that they did. For example, if we, in the beginning, when Twitter was coming on in 2008, 2009, for example, if we saw a tweet about there's a shootout going on so-and-so avenue in the city, and we immediately retweeted that without checking if it was true. And then we started learning that sometimes criminals would tweet about, a shooting going on at a certain part of the city, where there was nothing going on there, because they wanted to draw attention to that part of the city so that they would clear the coast in another part of the city, and they would go do their stuff there. We started catching on to that, for example. And so if we saw a tweet saying there is a shootout or a robbery or something going on in, this part of the city, we verified it first. And we learned to live with the fact that we lost some immediacy, but gained accuracy in what we were reporting. So it led us to be much more rigorous. And I caught on to this a couple of years ago when there was a school shooting in Torreón. like like the ones you see in the U.S. very often. It's just that they don't happen here. A kid took 2 guns to school and started shooting in the courtyard, and he killed one of his teachers and wounded 6 people. And I saw how the reporters were bending over backwards to not report on the rumors that were inevitably swirling around the stories, but verify the facts before. And that might seem pretty basic, and that might seem pretty obvious, but before we experienced this wave of narco violence, that is what we did. We unleashed the rumors, and we didn't care about reporting unverified facts. We have learned to be much more rigorous, and I think that is also at least something positive that we can get from this.
It's interesting you say that, because you would imagine that greater rigor in revealing, say, corruption, or greater rigor in revealing the specific actions of drug traffickers would put you and other Mexican journalists at increased risk.
Yeah, that's true. The rigor carries forward into other topics. In the case of corruption investigations, there is, of course, an increased risk because it's becoming more and more easy to kill a journalist. Every journalist that is killed, one journalist that is killed today was killed in part because the killing of the last journalist went unpunished. Anybody thinking right now, any 2-bit mayor or governor or whatever, thinking about killing a journalist, exposing corruption in their administration, can be reasonably certain that he can get away with it because the last guy that did it got away with it. So impunity is really the problem here. So for journalists, it becomes much more delicate when we're dealing with corruption to see what the consequence is going to be. That is why I was saying about trying to spread the risk a little bit, and maybe getting somebody to collaborate on the story, getting the backing of a national news organization or an NGO that is helping you with the reporting. And so when you publish it, it's not just you publishing it, it's another organization. So it's much more difficult for the subject to retaliate because there is much more exposure.
Any final words that you'd like sort of, the American audience to get a sense of from your experience reporting in such difficult conditions? Any sort of reflections that would be useful, here on this side of the border?
Well, I'd like to make 2 final observations. One is that it is always very much appreciated how organizations outside Mexico take care to look at what's going on and to expose it and make it more visible, shine a light on what's happening with Mexican journalists. And I think ASU has done a great job of doing that. Also, helping a lot of journalists along the border, with the reporting, right? We know that it's one of the regions in Mexico that is more prone to violence. But it's always very helpful and very encouraging to see that there are others that are trying to shine a light into what is going on. The second part would be as to what is going on in the United States would be sort of a warning. We are letting, and this is, going on everywhere, many countries, we are letting the value of free press and the value of free speech deteriorate. We are in many ways trivializing it. I think as politicians feel that they can basically cut the intermediary, which is basically the journalist, and go directly to the people in their information bubbles through social media, for example, people start feeling that they have less need for the media, right? Without realizing what they are losing, without realizing that they are losing an ally that has helped them make sense of what is going on in their community. And this is especially true of local journalism, which I think in the US as in Mexico is the one that is struggling the most. People still haven't realized what happens when they lose a source of news. What happens when you lose the people that were telling you which parts of the cities are more viable, which parts of the cities are unsafe, which parts of the cities have the problems in public services, which parts of the city have problems in their water supply, which parts of the cities have problems in their traffic, whatever, any number of elements of daily local journalism. People don't know what they miss until that's gone. And I think that is really something that we must really try to work hard to salvage.
That was very beautifully said. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. Thank you so much, Javier, for speaking with us, and we wish all of you a good evening.
Thank you, Daniel. Thanks to ASU, and thank you to everybody.